My name is Nona, and today I will counter argue my opponent's debate, and I will negate that the death penalty needs to be abolished. So, for this debate, I'm arguing pro death penalty, which is also known as capital punishment. So, when we talk about the threats of the death penalty, for me, it's pretty simple. If you don't want to have death penalty as a threat, don't commit a heinous crime. So, as my opponent stated, the death penalty has been in existence for centuries. It has been used as a final form of punishment by almost all countries at some point in time, and currently 55% of countries are actively using the death penalty. And we are one of them. And as reported by the Death Penalty Information Center, which is where I got a lot of my data for this debate, as of 2026, 27 states authorized the use of the death penalty and 23 have abolished it. And even though the 27 states do have it in place, a lot of them aren't actively using it and don't have any prisoners on death row. I think this research shows that the states want to have the option to use capital punishment, but they're not doing it, which I also believe supports the fact that they're using a lot of high consideration for putting prisoners on death row and for actually using the death penalty, because the data shows that a higher number of states want the option to use it as the ultimate deterrent. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the foundational UN document mentioned by my opponent, is supported by the United States. However, it's not a legally binding treaty, and we don't strictly follow every article here in the US. We are actually primarily governed by, with our human rights, by the Constitution and the federal civil rights laws. And the Supreme Court has ruled that the death penalty does not violate the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. And the Eighth Amendment does shape certain procedural aspects regarding when a jury may use the death penalty and how it must be carried out. Innocent people being sentenced to a crime is a travesty of our broken justice system that we've unfortunately seen for a while. And the Innocent Project has reported that since 1973, at least 200 people have been exonerated from death row. And a 2014 study done by the Death Penalty Information Center shows that 4% of those sentenced to death are innocent. And although I'm saying that is a travesty, 96% of those people are believed to be guilty. And so call it a 96% success rate, if you will. Now, I'm not saying that people dying is a success. I am simply saying that the statistics show that the success rate fairly outweighs the failure rate when it comes to the death sentence. Also, prisoners are not sent to death row without a highly specialized multi-stage judicial process. These steps are put in place to ensure that the death penalty, as protected by the Eighth Amendment, complies with the evolving standards of decency. And death row is used for appeals. It's used for further security in a person's guilt. And I just think all of those things, again, show that there's high consideration being used when placing people on death row, and more consideration used even before their execution. History does show that the death penalty is surrounded by racism, and I will not argue that or with history. However, I heard my opponent say that 41% of people on death row are Black, which is true. However, some information that I found from that same data may have been left out, and that is that 42% of inmates on death row are white, with 15% being Latina and 2% being of other race. So I do think that shows a balance in race on death row, with 1% being greater of white people. And so although racism may be rooted in the death penalty rooted in racism, I think today it's being used not as a racist tool, but as a tool for deterring and for legal purposes and for the law. Because states don't use the death penalty does have lower murder rates is not evidence of a failure of deterrence. Many things contribute to how much crime a state has, including the economic conditions, the population, access to resources, geographics. Again, according to the Death Penalty Information Center, capital punishment doesn't act as a deterrent, but I don't think that murderers pause in the midst of their crime and think to themselves about the consequences or weighing out what they're going to have happen. Um, the death penalty is there so that offenders won't reoffend, and bad people need to be off the streets. And when these bad people are put in prison and they continue to reoffend, we need a system in place that we can say no more. I researched Kenneth Eugene Smith, which is the death row prisoner that was spoke about, who was said to be given a botched injection. My research shows that actually none of the nurses were able to locate a vein, so it wasn't and there was never actually an injection given. So after about an hour and a half, they called off the execution, and they took almost 2 years to then go back and forth between the Supreme Court and the local courts in order to find a different method. And they did that after 2 years. And although witnesses described Smith as convulsing on the table for several minutes after he was given the nitrogen hypoxia, not 20 minutes, several minutes, I would ask, I wonder if his victim convulsed on the floor after she died. Because the reality of it is that his victim was a 45-year-old mother who was a pastor's wife. And he stabbed her in the chest 10 times with a fire poker, a walking cane, and a pipe. And so when we're talking about inhumane, that's pretty inhumane to me. I also want to note a couple other things about this case. He was convicted not once, but twice of this crime. And so there was no question of guilt. And he stayed on death row appealing his case unsuccessfully for 34 years. So that's 34 years he got to live that Elizabeth, his victim, did not get to live. So again, inhumane. What about the victims of the crimes? What about the families? These families have to live. This little child had to grow up without a mother for the rest of their life. So capital punishment is only assigned to the most violent criminals, people who are killing, murdering. And what is stopping somebody who is sentenced to life without parole, if that's the final say so, from killing once they get into jail, killing officers, fellow inmates, and prison officials? So having the final ability to once and for all end their violent crimes is necessary. A study by Isaac Elrich in 1973, the results found that for every inmate executed, 7 lives were spared because others were deterred from committing murder. And I just want to argue that capital punishment for the worst offenders is necessary. It keeps more deaths from happening. It gives retribution to victims and their families. And it allows for a final stop if we have people who just are not obeying the law. Thank you.